Hello everyone, this is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Well, this episode is part of the series on my channel called Type 1 Diabetics Talk, where both host and guest are Type 1s, and you guessed it, we discuss Type 1 diabetes and related topics. So today's guest has quite the resume. Let's start. She's a registered nurse. She's also a certified diabetes educator. She's a proponent of Dr. Richard Bernstein's diabetes management protocol. She's a diabetes coach at DiaVerge Diabetes, and she's a public speaker. She's also co-founder of Type 1 Grit, the Facebook group that spreads the message of normal blood sugars for all Type 1 diabetics. And she's the author of 2 books. First one is called... One book?
If you have 2, I'm curious what the second one is.
Is it the pregnancies one?
Yes, Grit Pregnancies.
Grit Pregnancies, How to Have a Healthy Pregnancy. Allison Herschede, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, Allison, I'm honored to have you. I mean, you've got a rich background. So where do we start? Let's start with your personal story. How and when you were diagnosed?
Sure. Well, I was too young to remember. I have little vague memories that maybe because stories have been told to me, but I was a year old. I was 18 months old. So I was very young. And I was exhibiting all the typical symptoms that you see with Type 1 diabetes. I was very thirsty. I was urinating frequently. I was losing weight. I wouldn't gain weight. I remember my mother said, for months and months, you would be 13 pounds and you wouldn't gain any weight. And looking back, she could tell, that it was the diabetes starting early. And I became so thirsty, I got to the point of drinking my bathwater. And my mom was very alarmed at this because her sister had been a Type 1 diabetic and she knew the signs. So she brought it up to our pediatrician and he says, it's July. It's hot outside. It's South Carolina. Of course she's thirsty. She's fine. Normal baby. There's nothing wrong. I would beg for juice. I'd say juice, and she'd give me juice. So this progressed and I started vomiting, which is another symptom. This is a symptom of diabetic ketoacidosis.
Yes.
And she was told I had the stomach flu and to give me Gatorade, which is loaded with sugar, of course.
Sugar.
And after this, I think the next day I progressed into a full-blown diabetic coma. And she runs me back into the pediatrician's office. And this time the partner was there, the pediatrician's partner, and he started swearing. He knew what was wrong. He could smell the ketones on my breath. Takes me in his arms and runs me across the street to the hospital. And they discovered that I was Type 1 diabetic, that my blood sugar was over 1,000, and I was in full-blown diabetic ketoacidosis.
What a scary story. I mean, it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for Type 1 diabetes.
Not, unfortunately. So many times I see it misdiagnosed or not diagnosed, or parents being dismissed. There's nothing wrong, and having to fight to get their child tested.
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon. So you're fortunate to be here. You're fortunate to be here.
I am. I am very fortunate.
You mentioned, Allison, some of the complications of, well, undiagnosed Type 1 diabetes, but I can confidently say that those complications wouldn't be dissimilar if Type 1 diabetes is not managed properly. The symptoms are very similar. So I would like to target this episode to the newly diagnosed Type 1s, or even to the parents of Type 1 children who are just diagnosed, because there's a lot of confusing information out there. A, there's a lot of misinformation, and B, there is a lot of conflicting information. So what are some of the complications of poorly managed type 1 diabetes?
I think some of them that most people are familiar with are diabetic nephropathy, which is diabetic kidney disease. The kidneys are damaged by high blood sugars. We have diabetic retinopathy, which is the eyes, the blood vessels in the retinas start becoming leaky and start bleeding and hemorrhaging, and this eventually can lead to blindness if blood sugar is uncontrolled. We have neuropathy, where the nerves are damaged due to high blood sugars. And this might start out as feeling pins and needles in your feet, feeling pain in your feet. Eventually, you stop having sensation at all. And this becomes very dangerous because the person could step on something, never realize it. It becomes infected. And then by the time they realize it, it may be too late. And then they end up with amputations. And I saw many of these when I worked as an RN in a hospital. I worked in the recovery room, and I would have to take care of these people who had had a foot removed. And it was just, it broke my heart, because at that point, all I could offer them was pain management. And I knew I have to help them. I have to prevent this from happening. We also have gastroparesis, which is a form of what they call autonomic neuropathy. It has to do with the nervous system that we don't control, like our heart rhythm and our stomach emptying, our temperature, blood pressure control. And in gastroparesis, this is vagus nerve damage, and the stomach empties slowly, but it's completely unpredictable. So you could eat something, inject your insulin, and then have a hypo episode because your food hasn't digested. And then hours and hours later, the food might digest all at once, and then you have this incredibly high blood sugar. So it's completely unpredictable. One of the hallmarks of gastroparesis is that it's unpredictable. We have smaller complications that Dr. Bernstein talks about, such as not having hair on your lower legs, or having poor circulation, not sweating. He says dry elbows are one, and I actually do not have the dry elbows, surprisingly. Missing the moons of your fingernails, and I'm missing the moons of my fingernails except for my thumbs, which this can also point to thyroid issues as well, so something to keep out for. What else am I missing? There's so many things. I think he tests for over 100 things when he does his full exam. So many things can be attributed to diabetes that you would never think about.
And retinopathies, of course, see, blindness. I was saddened to read recently, someone posted, because I'm in part of type 1 sort of groups, in her 30s, she's totally blind now in both eyes. It's
I've seen 29-year-olds on dialysis for kidney failure. I've seen 29-year-olds having toes amputated. This happens a lot earlier than we think. And the pediatric endocrinologists don't talk about the complications. And I think it's because they don't see the complications, because that child is out the door when they're 18. So the endocrinologist is just seeing them before all these things take place. And I think a lot of endos kind of promote the idea that there's this magical protection in childhood from complications, and that isn't true. We're seeing frequent studies showing, brain damage from hyperglycemia. Everyone worries about hypoglycemia causing brain damage, but it's the hypers that are repeatedly showing, gray matter, white matter, everything, all this growth is stunted, cognitive abilities, IQ is lower in these children who have high blood sugars. So that's really something we need to keep an eye on and be aware of.
It does come down to what most pediatricians or endocrinologists would call normal blood sugars for type 1 diabetics.
Yes.
And what our circle or Dr. Bernstein's followers or people who actually want to raise the bar and want to achieve real normal blood sugars rather than diabetic blood sugars.
Yes.
So just what are your thoughts on diabetic blood sugars? There's something irritating about it, right? When you hear that.
It's incredibly frustrating because the widely accepted time in range is 70 milligrams per deciliter to 180 milligrams per deciliter, which is 3.9 millimoles to about 10 millimoles per liter. And those higher numbers, while in range, are still causing damage. we know that as the blood sugars start to rise above normal, we start seeing damage. We'll see damage in an A1C of 5.5%, which is not even considered diabetic. And this is in the general population. We start seeing things like retinopathy and cardiovascular disease is, I'm losing my words, connected to A1C incrementally.
Yes.
So I personally target a range of 70 to 120. Some people are even tighter than that who follow Dr. Bernstein. I find that when I try to target lower than that, I have too many episodes of hypoglycemia. So I'm pretty happy if I'm in a range of 70 to 120 and I target a standard deviation of about 20 or 1.1 millimoles or less. And that's kind of a measure of variability. How much is your blood sugar going up and down? Are we on a roller coaster all day long, or are we holding somewhat flat? Obviously, no one's completely flat, but that's the goal. Dr. Bernstein promotes a blood sugar of 83 milligrams per deciliter, which is 4.6 millimoles per liter, I believe. And he learned this from seeing a lot of diabetes drug reps, meter reps, who were young and healthy and fit, not obese, and they all seem to have a blood sugar around 83. So he decided this was the blood sugar. So 83 is my target. I'm not always there. No one is perfect. Everyone has bad days, but 83 is my target.
I find it hard to stay at 83.
Yeah.
Not that I never get there. I do, but to stay stable at that level,
yeah,
it doesn't mean it won't ever happen. I mean, I'm work in progress, right? We're constantly improving our.
Well, it's an imperfect system, the human body. There's so many different variables.
Constantly tweaking.
We can control the big variables. Yeah. And that's food. That's the biggest variable I can control. So once I've got that variable under control, all the other little ones start to become a lot more visible. We can say hormones are affecting my blood sugar, or even the weather, as crazy as that sounds. You know, it becomes hot, your insulin needs go down. It becomes cold, they go up, vice versa for some people. Just so many different things can affect your blood sugars.
You know, it's funny you mentioned the weather. I'm a frequent traveler, so I'm on a pump. But on my pump, I have different basal settings. And I have different settings for different countries. Because
I love it.
My blood sugars are completely different. And then when I'm in California, blood sugars are completely they're not mine. So it must be the weather. I think also, you know, your quality of sleep, what time you wake up in the morning, whether your body's
just the stress of traveling,
whether you're
being outside your normal.
Yeah, true. So I have different basal settings for different countries.
That's amazing.
It sounds ridiculous, but that's what works for me. So okay, now some of those complications, are they reversible or I mean, they are preventable. We know they are preventable.
They're absolutely preventable.
Our blood sugars stay in normal range most of the time. However, are they reversible? I think Dr. Bernstein has a whole chapter in his book on gastroparesis, for example.
Yes, he does.
So which ones of these are reversible? It's a tough one.
This is highly debatable. There are people who would disagree with me, but I've personally, from my own experience and from observing others, I've seen people reverse their complications. I have reversed complications. I was able to reverse gastroparesis and vagus nerve damage. Personally, I've seen people reverse neuropathy. I've seen people reverse mild retinopathy. I would say kidney damage. Even Dr. Bernstein had stage 3 kidney disease, and he reversed that just through normalizing his blood sugars with a high protein diet, which would be very much frowned upon by most of the doctors. And I think probably after you get to about stage 4 of kidney disease, it is probably too late to reverse, or if you have very proliferative retinopathy. I have my own experience with my mother. She had many diabetes complications, and she really tried towards the end to normalize her blood sugars, but it was too late at that point, and she would literally sneeze and her eyes would hemorrhage. So at a certain point, it is too late, but you can still, you know, better your quality of life by normalizing your blood sugars, even if you do have complications.
Was your mother type 1 diabetic?
She was labeled a type 2 because she was obese. Looking back, I think she was probably LADA, or latent autoimmune diabetic in adults. She was insulin dependent, but no one ever tested her because she was overweight. So we'll never know. But given the family history, I think it's a good possibility.
Mm-hmm. Allison, when did you discover the low carbohydrate way of eating?
That would be 2010. I was 30 years old and I was 210 pounds. I was taking about 15 prescription medications at 30 years old. I was taking medications for hypertension. I was taking medications for high cholesterol, for depression, for sleep, for frequent infections. I would get pneumonia once or twice a year, every year. I was always sick. If anything went around, Allison had it. I missed numerous days of school. I had to drop out of college because I just was so physically exhausted. I couldn't handle it physically. And then in my adulthood, I would lose jobs, or I would quit a job before getting fired because I was missing so many days due to my diabetes. So at this point in my life, it was like, I've got to do something. Like, I think that was my rock bottom. And I said, I'm sick of being sick. I'm sick of being overweight. And a friend of mine, a fellow type 1, had mentioned, pointing me at this website, this man named Steve Cooksey, who he's known as the diabetes warrior. And he was talking about reversing type, well, he just said reversing diabetes with a low carb diet. And I became irate. I said, you cannot reverse diabetes with a low carb diet. This is, you're lying. This is misinformation. I wrote him a nasty email. And he wrote back to me and said, I'm talking about type 2 diabetes, but he could be quite helpful for a type 1 diabetic. And I was still angry at that point. But what he said started to sink in because it made sense. Carbohydrates raise my blood sugar. So if I lower those carbohydrates, then my blood sugar won't go so high. It seems like purely logical, right? And I had tried low carb diets in the past. But every time I tried a low carb diet, I would experience low blood sugars. And this is one of the things the doctors warn against. So low carb will cause low blood sugars. Well, I'm here to tell you, low blood sugars are not due to a lack of food or a lack of carbohydrate. They're due to too much insulin.
Yes.
And that's the thing that I had never understood, that I could adjust my own insulin. And when I finally discovered I could adjust my own insulin, I cut my insulin dose in half. And I ended up normalizing the cholesterol, normalizing the blood pressure. It even became low, like on the low end of normal. Every health marker became optimal except for my A1C. My A1C was lower, but it was not where I wanted it. And he had mentioned Dr. Bernstein, and I'd gone through the book, that book back there. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a big book.
It is.
And it can be overwhelming. It is a lot of information. And as many times as I've read it now, I still miss things. And Dr. Bernstein has accused me of not reading his book. I'm like, no, I promise I've read your book. It's just a lot of information. So I kind of skimmed the book. And I thought, well, I'm eating low carb. I'm following Dr. Bernstein. But I wasn't. I was missing a lot of things. And around 2014, I met some people in the Dr. Bernstein group, Artie Deitman being one, Derek Rollerson, Debbie Wright. We started chatting in a Facebook chat, and they started telling me tips and tricks. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to actually buckle down and read Bernstein's book and actually put this into place. And there were so many things I was missing because in general diabetes education, we're taught to count carbohydrate, right? We're given an insulin to carb ratio, 1 to 15. 1 unit of insulin per 15 carbs, or 1 unit of insulin per 50 milligrams per deciliter to correct blood sugars above 200, maybe above 150 if you're lucky. And so I was following this regimen from about 2000 when I started an insulin pump, and it doesn't work. Anybody who has a continuous glucose monitor until you would work. They think it might be working, but blood sugar is just part of being a type 1 diabetic. I used to literally laugh at type 2s who would say, 150 is high. My blood sugar is high today. I say, you have no idea. And now I consider 120 high or 6.7. So that was one of the main things I was missing. I was not correcting until I was at a much higher number. I was not targeting that 83 or 4.6. I was not covering protein with insulin. And that's a big one. None of us are taught that protein needs coverage. No doctor even, like most endocrinologists would tell you protein is free. But if you're watching that graph and you eat a steak, you're going to see an upward trend, rise overnight. And I'll end up to 200, 250 just from a steak if I didn't take insulin. So that was another huge part I was missing. I was not covering protein with insulin. And then there's the rule of 15 when you have a low blood sugar. And I was required to teach this to new onset diabetics, to the children, to the parents of children. 15 grams, 15 minutes. If your blood sugar hasn't gone up, take another 15 grams. Well, I'm here to tell you 15 grams would take me much higher than my target. And for a little child, it's going to send through the roof. And that's what I would see when I did my rotation of student nursing in the schools. These poor little kids would just be on a roller coaster. They wouldn't treat a high blood sugar until they were 250 or 300. And then they were low. And they treat with that 15 grams and then they were high again. So what Dr. Bernstein teaches is testing how much does 1 gram of glucose raise your blood sugar.
Yes.
And in knowing this, I can precisely treat my blood sugars to target and only using glucose because I would eat whatever, juice was the standard, but cereal, a muffin, a cookie, whatever I had on hand, that's what I would use. And then I would end up eating more. I'd eat the bowl of cereal and say, oh, I still have a little milk left. I'll add some more cereal. And then I'm 300.
I've done that too. Because if you're crashing from some high point, unbelievably abnormally high, you're crashing and you're crashing rapidly. Yeah. You're hungry, you're ravenously hungry. I just can't control it. Like you'd open the fridge door and, anything you can find, you stuff yourself with it. So I've done that too. And then I would realize after about 15 minutes, forget checking the blood sugars, I would realize I've overeaten now.
And now I have to take more insulin.
I would take more insulin to actually counter that. And that roller coaster is not something I miss. It wasn't a nice feeling. I mean, especially middle of the night, right? Middle of the night, I'm just heading to the kitchen. And it's the worst thing. And by the morning, you don't remember what you've eaten and how much insulin you've taken. It's crazy way of living. I've been there. I've done that, despite the fact that I could count my carbohydrates beautifully. I actually attended here in the UK. The course is free. I've done a refresher course as well. They would invite us in groups to the hospital. And using props like fruits and whatever, packets of food. We'd read the labels and how much carbohydrate and how much insulin we'd need for that. I took these courses. I helped other type 1 diabetics learn how to count carbohydrates, except that it didn't work. I don't know if it worked for them. It certainly didn't work for me. So Allison, you mentioned something really important when you said, when people are first diagnosed, their endos will give them a ratio of how much insulin they need to take to how much to I don't know, to 10 grams. I think it's per 10 grams of carbohydrates. That's what I used to do.
That's a very common,
yeah. So divide the carbs into grams. I mean, we use grams quite a lot here, so in the UK. So, but no one ever teaches them that you also need to take insulin for protein. You mentioned that. So how much insulin do people need for protein generally? What does Dr. Bernstein say?
His recommendation is a starting point, and this is just a starting point because everyone is different, but a half unit of our insulin per 6 ounces, I believe, of protein food. And it gets very confusing when we talk about grams for the people in the UK and the people who measure in grams, because he's talking about grams of weight, not grams of protein. A lot of people get very confused and think, well, that's not very much protein at all. No, we're talking grams of weight. So there's about, I'm trying to remember. No, I completely told you wrong. Half ounce per ounce of protein food, which is about 6 grams of protein. That's where I got the 6 from.
Right.
So starting point. But the thing is, all protein is not equal, and all carbohydrates are not equal. And that's why these ratios don't work. Because for me, and for most people that I work with, beef needs more insulin than, for instance, chicken. And chicken thighs need more insulin than chicken breasts for me. Shrimp and seafood need very little to no insulin.
Yeah.
Eggs and cheese are kind of a little bit. And you kind of just have to learn through trial and error how much you need. So that half unit of our insulin, it's also known as Act Rapid or Humulin S. In other countries, I think it's also known as Toronto in Canada. Toronto, Novolin GE Toronto insulin. It's a short-acting insulin. It has a slower onset and a longer duration, so it really covers that protein beautifully. But I know you had mentioned to me that you can't access our insulin, and a lot of people can't access our insulin. So we have to do it with rapid acting.
Correct.
And that's a whole different ballgame. So what I did there, because I had trouble with R personally, it was too fast for me. Like the R insulin would hit before the protein hit for me. And I finally discovered I needed to give it well after the meal, like about an hour and a half after the meal. But when I was not using R, what I would do is I would watch my continuous glucose monitor, or if you don't have one, check your blood sugar 1 to 2 hours after the meal. Look for a rise. When you start to see that rise, you know you need coverage. So what you do is you test how long does that insulin take to become active. So this Novorapid, Humalog, whatever you're taking, you're going to, or Novolog here in the United States, test how long it takes to become active. And then test how long it takes for that protein to cause a rise in your blood sugar. And then you attempt to match the two up. So if the rise is happening at 1.5 hours and it takes 30 minutes for that insulin to become active, we give it at the 1 hour mark.
Tell me if I'm completely wrong, but I do quite a lot of experiments on myself. I mean, it's the best way to learn, right?
Absolutely. It's always an experiment.
So with, you said Novorog, so my rapid acting is Novorapid, which is, I think they're the same insulin. So I've noticed, I've tried to test when it actually reaches its peak. When I don't have food on board, it reaches peak within 20 minutes. When I have food on board, it reaches peak at the second hour, hour 2. So 2 hours after.
Very interesting information. Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
And I've done it over and over again. So now I know exactly when to take my rapid acting insulin to cover the protein, but it is a challenge and it changes every day. So you've just got to be vigilant and monitor.
That's what we have to do, is we have to test everything. That's one of the biggest things Dr. Bernstein stresses is trial and error. And no one wants to hear trial and error. We want an algorithm. We want a rule. And there is no rule. Everyone is different. And you just have to test out meals, test out insulin doses, test out timing until you figure it out.
Yeah, it makes it interesting, right? Because it's constantly changing.
Also true, especially with growing children, kids in puberty,
and
women with a menstrual cycle,
Women in perimenopause. It's just everything is changing now. Everything that I just drew up and set up on my palm is just out of whack.
It's no longer correct.
It's out of whack, so I've got to start all over again. But hey, it's it's another challenge, and I'm not used to it because it's kind of new to me. So
and that's where we go back to basal testing. Go back to basal testing, go back to testing 1 unit, go back to testing 1 gram.
Yeah.
Because those are the 3 key factors. Is your basal insulin accurate? How much does 1 unit lower you? How much does 1 gram raise you? And those things can change. So when I start to see things are getting wacky, I go ahead and test again because it may be different.
Let's talk about the basal testing. So for someone who's newly diagnosed, they're given a standard sort of set of sort of basal dosage. But how do they test? I mean, over time, they would have to test because what your endo thinks you need may not be correct. So
Right.
how does one do basal testing?
Well, for basal testing, we're fasting. We are looking at what our basal insulin is doing in the absence of food. So, because that's what basal is supposed to do, it's supposed to be covering the glucose that your liver's releasing, the glucose that your body's making when you're fasting, when you're sleeping, when you're not eating. So, if our basal is correct, we can skip a meal and blood sugar will hold flat. If you're going low when you fast, that's a sure sign that your basal insulin's too high. And a lot of times a doctor will say, oh, your blood sugar's high, I'm going to increase your basal. When in fact, it's not the basal that's the problem, it's the bolus that's the problem, or it's the food that's the problem.
Yes.
So for an adult, for anyone, we start with DiaVerge. We came up with this idea. This is not Bernstein. Lisa actually came up with this idea, Lisa Lanasa. We do a vegetable-based dinner. So like a big stir fry maybe, or a big salad, or some people do like a little charcuterie board with vegetables and olives and pickles and things like that. We want something that you can easily cover with insulin that does not have protein and fat, or that is low in protein and fat, and will be out of your system within those 4 hours that it takes for the Humalog or Novolog to get out of your system. Then after that, go to sleep. And we're looking at overnight. And sleep as long as you can, so do it on a weekend. It's easier if you're asleep.
Yeah.
So then we're going to fast as long as you tolerate. And there are a few little freebie foods you can do in the meantime. You can eat sugar-free gelatin if it does not contain the ingredient maltodextrin, and that is in a lot of the gelatin. So maltodextrin is higher on the glycemic index than sugar itself. It raises blood sugar rapidly. So you want to make sure it doesn't have that, your Jello. You can do generally like a little nori seaweed snacks. You can do like a dill pickle is generally free, a few olives. I'll tell people to make a milkshake with unsweetened nut milk and like a sugar-free flavoring. So that's kind of a freebie. Just things that don't need insulin. We fast as long as you tolerate. If your blood sugar drops, you stop the test. You treat the hypo. If your blood sugar goes high, you stop the test. You treat the high blood sugar. This is not a game of how long can I fast and to your detriment of your health. So some people can't tolerate a lot of time fasting. And if that's the case, then we will break it up over a period of days. We'll say on one day, okay, we're going to have an early breakfast and a late lunch. So we can get some hours in between and find out what your basal's doing. And you might have an early lunch and a late dinner. So you see what I'm saying? You can do this, I'll break it up over a period of days so you're not fasting for 24 hours, because that's a hard thing to do. So if you see blood sugar dropping, then you know basal is too high. And if you see blood sugar rising, you know basal is too low.
Would you say that the basal testing would be accurate if someone wanted to fast for 24? I mean, I can easily fast for 24 hours, but would the results be accurate, or would I have to look at it in kind of chunks, as you suggested?
I will say it has been suggested that, for instance, I'll start dropping around the 22-hour point. And I think it is because my body has just burned through my glycogen reserves. So it's possible that after a certain point, it's not going to be accurate. And you may want to just, let's do a basal test during the dinner hour. We'll have an early lunch and a very late dinner and see what we're doing during the dinner hour, for instance.
Yeah, I've noticed that mine actually, I completely deplete my glycogen stores past the 12th hour. So if I'm fasting the whole day, past the 12th hour, that's it, I'll start dropping. So even with very,
need to break it up. Yeah.
Right. So how do the endos then, for the newly diagnosed people, work out their carb to insulin to carb ratio?
They have some little algorithms they use based on total daily dose of insulin. And in my experience, they don't work at all. For a person on a low carb diet, it's assuming you're going to be eating a certain number of carbohydrates. So it's completely inaccurate when you're using it on a low carber. So what I do to get an insulin to carb ratio, if I wanted to use one, I don't use one, but to get an accurate insulin to carb ratio, I would say we take your insulin sensitivity factor, which is how much 1 unit lowers your blood sugar, divide it by your glucose sensitivity factor, which is one that a lot of people have never heard of. I might have made up that word, I'm not sure. But how much does 1 gram of glucose raise your blood sugar? So for instance, if 1 gram lowered me 50 milligrams per deciliter, and 1 gram of glucose, oh, there goes my Dexcom. If 1 gram of glucose raised me 5 milligrams per deciliter, then I could take 50, divide it by 10, and get, I'm sorry, take 50 divided by 5 and get an insulin to carb ratio of 1 to 10.
I'll put this calculation maybe on the screen later on for people. So now my question is, how do you come up with those factors? So insulin sensitivity. How do you test someone? How do you come up with that figure?
Optimally 4 hours after your last bolus or fasting.
Yes.
When blood sugar is on the higher range, so maybe around 8 milliliters per liter or 140 milligrams per deciliter, we test the effects of 1 unit of rapid-acting insulin. We're going to inject this fasting and then watch your blood sugar over a period of hours and see how much it drops. Now, for a child who's extremely insulin sensitive, we're not going to use a full unit. If you think a half unit is even too much, we'll eyeball between the lines to get an even smaller amount. If you're using an insulin pump, that's much easier. We could test even 0.1 units.
Yes.
But we'll use the formula to decide how much 1 unit lowers blood sugar. And then for glucose, we want to do it on the opposite spectrum when blood sugar is lower. So I tell people maybe below 100 milligrams per deciliter, which I think that's about 5.5, I think.
So 5.6, yeah, 5.5, 5.6.
And they'll take a designated amount of glucose. So for me, I might just take 5 grams. A little child probably wouldn't need more than 1 gram because they can be extremely sensitive to carbohydrate. So I like dextrose-based candies, and this is what I recommend to people if they don't want to use liquid glucose, which is my favorite. And these are available in the United States. This is Sweet Tarts and Spree. Bottle caps. All of these are around 1 gram of carbohydrate. You could also take a standard glucose tab and break it into fourths to get 1 gram.
That's what I do. Here's mine. Yeah.
There you go. I love that Dextro Energy. I found that when I went to England and I loved it.
It's readily available and it's relatively cheap. So, yeah.
But I did find our version, or your version, I should say, of the Smarties Americans use, which are not the same Smarties as the chocolate. These are dextrose-based candies. I think I have one. These are Smarties.
Right.
And I believe on your end, they're called Fizzers or something.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that's right. That's right.
And I don't know if you have these, but these are given out in like little birthday party packs, 66, and it's just powdered dextrose. This is 2 grams of powdered dextrose, so that's good for little kids.
I haven't seen them. Interesting stuff.
For that, we're testing how much it raises blood sugar.
Right. So what would be a good target range then for someone newly diagnosed? Where would you start? Would you just start off with I mean, if they've presented, right, like your case with high blood sugars to their doctors, right? Blood sugars of, I don't know, 22 in our measurement or 300, 396 in your measurements. These are high blood sugars. So where do you start with them?
We would start at a higher target because you bring down blood sugars rapidly. One, you're going to have symptoms of hypoglycemia even at a normal blood sugar. I've experienced this repeatedly with clients who, if they're used to running 300, they'll even feel hypo at 200. So you have to slowly lower that target. So if they've been running 300, then maybe target 250 and just work your way down week by week. I know even Dr. Bernstein with his well-controlled patients, he'll start them at 120. Even if they've been running lower already, he'll start them at 120. And he'll say, if you're below 120, we're going to treat that as a hypo, and we're going to treat you up to 120. If you're above 120, we correct to 120, and then we lower it to 100. And then we slowly, progressively lower that target so it's more comfortable. And so we don't see any what they call treatment-induced complications, which I've only recently learned about. For instance, neuropathy can suddenly present if blood sugar is rapidly reduced. So if a person's been running very high blood sugars and they suddenly normalize them, they might experience symptoms of neuropathy. Or if someone already has retinopathy present, it can temporarily become worse if you rapidly reduce blood sugar.
I've heard of that one, but I didn't know of the neuropathy as well. So, so gradually decreasing the target range. I was going to ask about the standard deviation. You mentioned it before, and you said you aim at what was it, 20 or
I aim for 20 or 1.1. And I know like the American Diabetes Association recommends, I think, less than 36% variability. So it's, or I think around 50 milligrams per deciliter, which is much higher. So I'm aiming for 20 or less, getting towards a non-diabetic level. That's not perfectly non-diabetic. A non-diabetic is going to be a bit lower than that, but the lower the better. But I typically run around 18 or 19 milligrams per deciliter for my standard deviation.
So if someone is using a glucometer, because not everyone has a CGM, right? I mean, with the CGM, you get this data on the app, right? How would they work out, or how would they calculate the their standard deviation? Is there a
I would look at the app that goes along with your meter. I think a lot of them will offer that in their app, like the Contour app, for instance.
Yes.
I would look there first. Otherwise, it's a big, long math problem that I don't remember off the top of my head. But it can definitely be done.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because for a long time, I used to wonder what my SD was. And then came along the CGM, made life so much easier.
So much easier.
Allison, in one of your, I think, Facebook, I can't remember where, maybe Facebook reel or something, or Instagram. I think in one of your Instagram reels, you check your A1C doing the home test. And you mentioned something like, so it was much higher before on a low carbohydrate diet, but now with fine tuning my diet, you got down to 4.4% A1C.
Yes, that was years ago.
What was your fine tune? It's still relevant though. I mean, how did you, what exactly did you fine tune to achieve a lower A1C?
All the things I mentioned we're reducing our carbohydrates, obviously. And I don't know if I went too much into that, but with Dr. Bernstein's plan, we're eliminating grains. So anything made with wheat, oats, rice, corn, anything like that. Sugars of any form, even natural. Starchy foods like potatoes and fruits. Some of us can get away with a few berries here and there, but for most people, fruits are going to raise blood sugar. And so that's the first place to start. Testing how much 1 unit lowers, how much 1 gram raises, and then looking at your Dexcom graphs if you have one, or Freestyle Libre. Go into their software and look at your graphs. And this is a client. Let me lock up the name. What I do is I print them out, and I do this for my own once a week. I print them out and I circle the highs and the lows. And then I look for a pattern. Like this is around the same time going up every day.
Yes.
So I'm going up about lunchtime or morning or whatever the case may be. I'm having a drop at 2 a.m. So we're adjusting insulin based on that. Am I dropping overnight? Do I see what I call a downward trend? If I see someone, for instance, at 80 at bedtime, and then you see it going down, or even if it starts at a higher number, they started at 150 and then it just goes down, and they wake up at like 90 and they think I'm great. My blood sugar is good. I woke up with a good number. That tells me their basal's too high, because the basal should not be pulling down blood sugar. It should be holding it flat. We want to correct a high blood sugar with rapid. And conversely, if we see an upward trend, we can say, okay, we probably need to increase the overnight basal.
So for someone, we did mention Dr. Richard Bernstein number of times during this conversation. So if someone isn't familiar with it, can you introduce his book very briefly, and very brief introduction of maybe his recommendations? So he promotes a higher carbohydrate diet, sorry. Oh, take it back.
No.
I take it back. Sorry, that was a mistake. So he obviously recommends higher protein diet, especially for growing children.
Yes.
Lower carbohydrate, and would you say moderate fat?
Yeah, he recommends, basically, he says the amount of fat that comes with the protein. But we're not making meals of fat. We're not adding fat. When I started out, I was doing the high fat keto stuff, and I was making fat bombs and bulletproof coffee and, oil and butter, and just trying to increase my fat intake. That is not what Dr. Bernstein does. Dr. Bernstein's plan is high protein and the fat that comes along with the protein, and then low carbohydrate. He recommends 6 grams of carbohydrate for breakfast, 12 grams for lunch, and 12 for dinner. For an adult, less for children by weight. And he actually targets blood sugars in the 70s or in the 4s for children rather than the 83 number for adults, because he has a couple studies he found showing that non-diabetic, non-obese children run lower numbers fasting. So that's very controversial. And I will just say Dr. Bernstein promotes that.
Yes. Okay, so you've got Dr. Bernstein's copy in the back. I'll probably put the link below. So if you're newly diagnosed, buy the book. I have to say, I haven't read it back to back, but I use it as reference.
It's a big book.
So it's by my bedside. So I kind of open it, and then every now and again, I just read the chapter and I go, yeah, I think I've read this chapter before, but let me read it again. So I kind of use it as a reference book. I wonder what Bernstein says about this, and then I go back to it because it's quite encyclopedic, I have to say. There's a huge amount of information there. And
it can be quite overwhelming. It's a lot of information. But I do exactly what you say. I actually use the ebook version, and I use the search function to find whatever I want. What does he say about this? What does he say about levemir? What does he say about protein? What does he say about hormones? And just type in that keyword.
And none of that information, by the way, is outdated. So it's still valid. None of it has been proven wrong, or none of it is outdated either. So I recommend that you buy the book if you're newly diagnosed, and just like we do, just use it as reference book. Let's talk about type 1 grit. The beautiful Facebook. I love type 1 grit Facebook group. So what do you guys promote in that group?
We promote Dr. Bernstein's protocols. So to even become a member, you have to have read the book. You have to have been following the program for a while, because we want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Because at the beginning, we had a lot of people who were, let's just say, haters, people who disagreed, who only joined the group to, start arguments. So we want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Now, if you're a newly diagnosed parent, you could probably send a message to one of the admins and explain, we're brand new, we're joining. But there is a great parents group Bethany McKenzie leads. It's called Parents of Recently Diagnosed Children with Type 1 Diabetes. And it is a wealth of resources. So highly recommend that group for parents. Type 1 Grit has parents, adults, people from a few months old up to probably 90 years old. We have all ages of diabetics in that group. It's wonderful.
And people from all over the world. I love that about the Type 1 Grit group. Allison, any last minute recommendations for particularly parents of Type 1 children, recently diagnosed Type 1 children?
Well, to reiterate, read Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. Join that group I just mentioned, Parents of Recently Diagnosed Children. And keep in mind that it's going to take a while. You're not perfect. I know a lot of the parents will see the flat lines from some of the Type 1 parents and think, I'm doing something wrong. I'm failing at this, but it takes time. And those beautiful flat lines you see are a result of corrections. And that's what I want a lot of parents to keep in mind is we're doing corrections. We're correcting highs. Here's a little glucose here. Here's a little insulin here. Like you heard my Dexcom go off just now. I'm at 125. So I just did a small bolus of insulin on my phone while we were talking to correct that 125. So it's not set it and forget it. And you're not a bad parent if your kid has a bad day, because we all have bad days. But just keep at it and know that you're doing the right thing by keeping your kid's blood sugar as normal as possible.
And control the carbohydrates.
That's the biggest factor.
It may be challenging. Well, it is challenging
Very
initially,
much so.
but if the whole family is doing it, you will get used to
That
it.
makes the biggest difference. If the whole family's on board, because if the whole family's on board, that child is going to feel resentful. They're going to feel left out. It's going to feel unfair. And they're going to sneak food. It has to be the whole family. And it's going to be healthy for everyone. You know, all the families I've seen who take part immediately, they're losing weight. They're the healthiest they've ever been in their lives. Everyone is healthier for it. So they're not losing anything.
Everyone benefits from a lower carbohydrate diet. So, I mean, even back in the 70s, when I was first diagnosed, back then there wasn't rapid acting insulin. And insulin dosing was like standard doses you had to take twice a day, or maybe even once a day initially. Yeah. And then you had to eat to cover the insulin. You need to bring in the carbs to cover the insulin, basically. So
you didn't eat, you went low.
That's correct. But the recommendation, funnily enough, back in the 70s, well, certainly in the Middle East, that's where I was born, it was low carbohydrate diet. It was limited amounts of bread, limited rice, limited pasta. Right. And they were in the limited group when my mom was given a part of what she can feed me. There's loads of proteins. Proteins were in the okay group. And I remember that. I remember that chart. So, and my father died when I was 2 years old. And so my mom moved in with her parents. So I actually lived in an extended family. And I don't remember any of my family members from grandpa to grandma sitting in there and, you know, stuffing their faces with ice cream or cakes. The only cakes I ever remember from my childhood were actually my birthday cakes. On my birthday.
Exactly the same. Cake. I would get an angel food cake once a year on my birthday because angel food cake was lower in fat and lower in sugar.
I remember my mom's cream and strawberry cake she made for me. I remember that vividly. But that's the only time I ever saw cake. So everyone in my extended family must have been doing lower carb.
Yeah.
With me. And then came rapid insulin, of course, and then everything just flipped and we were told, oh, we've got the magic insulin now, just eat what you want and cover it. And you know,
and things have actually gone downhill. The A1Cs have actually gone up since all the technology. You would think the complete opposite, but we have rapid acting insulin now. We have insulin pumps. We have closed loop systems, and the A1Cs are higher. That should be something.
So what's an optimal A1C? What do you try to target?
I target less than 5%.
Do you always get there?
No. I think the last one I took was 5.1. I've been in the range of probably 4.7 to 5.2 for 8 or 9 years now. That 4.4 was the lowest I had. And that was with a lot of mental effort.
Yes.
So I know I can get to 4.4 with a lot of strain. I can typically get to 4.8 with a lot less strain. So that's usually what I aim for.
Allison.
But you don't have to aim for perfection. Any progress is progress. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah. And gradual progress is good. I mean, I'm work in progress. I'm getting there. I've never seen A1C before. Well, except mine, I've never seen any of my A1Cs below 5 yet. Doesn't mean it won't happen. So, you know, I'm working on it.
Yes.
Listen, I can't thank you enough for your time today. So I'm so pleased we met and we talked about these important topics. One last thought, though, before I say goodbye. what would you say to people when they say, okay, with a lower A1C is around 5% or even lower, then you must be having tons of symptomatic, dangerous, I'm talking about dangerous hypos. What would you say to those people?
I understand why the doctors think that. Every time I go to a new doctor, they take a look and they say, you must be having a lot of hypoglycemia. And then I have to show them my Dexcom graphs to prove that I'm not, because that's what they see every day. They normally see high A1Cs. And I have this experience personally working in an endocrine clinic. There are higher numbers. And when that one kid comes in with even a 6%, it's because he's having a lot of lows, almost without fail. So we're the odd ones out. We are not what they normally see. So they're expecting you must be getting this low A1C from a lot of hypoglycemia. But really, we're getting this A1C through normal blood sugars. Like, me personally, staying within that 70 to 120 range, I can get a 4.8 A1C. And I target less than 4% in hypo, less than 1% in very low, just like the American Diabetes Association recommends. I stick with that one so they can't fight me and say I'm running low. And generally I can do that and hold around 4.8. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you also think that hypoglycemia itself should probably be redefined for someone who's in nutritional ketosis? Because we are on a low carbohydrate diet. We're probably fueled more by fat than by glucose, right? And so, if someone has no hypoglycemic symptoms, they're in they're functioning fully mentally, physically, and they're 3.8 or 60, 67, right? Are they hypoglycemic? Would you worry about that? And I don't think that should be concerning to my endo, but he didn't seem to understand, because I can stay at 3.8 and I can just go straight. Like my graph would definitely go straight, not go lower. I wouldn't drop lower. So just be about 3.8, 3.9, 3.8, 3.9, 4, 3.8 all day long. I could stay at that figure and be in full functioning mode. But my endo worries about that. So what would you say?
Well, there are some studies in the literature showing neuroprotective qualities of ketones on the brain and hypoglycemia. There have been studies where I think they took people and had them down to like 20 milligrams per deciliter, and they were perfectly fine because they were in full ketosis. That said, I treat anything less than 70 or anything less than 3.9 as hypo, just to be on the safe side. I just don't see a benefit in running low. And I know Dr. Bernstein himself will treat anything under target. So I know a few years ago, I think he treated a 78 with like 1 or 2 grams of glucose. So if you feel comfortable doing that, I'm going to say that is absolutely your choice. And there is literature to back you up. But I personally am going to try to stay a little bit higher than that.
Yeah. You see, I only treat if I notice that I'm dropping further. So then obviously, but if I'm staying sort of straight, I don't always treat, and I do stay stable.
Yeah.
So,
that's wonderful.
3.8 on the CGM could very well be 3.9 or 4, because it does vary. So every 15 minutes I'm scanning 3.8, 3.9, and then next it's 4, and then 4.1, and then back to 3.9. So it kind of, you get the margin of error as well. But as long as I'm staying stable, I don't always treat. Anything below 3.8, 3.7, I do treat. But I do treat anything below 4 if I see the arrow or the trend moving down. Anyway, well, what a fun conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Allison.
Thank you for having me.